On a wet Thursday morning in April of 1991, a $50,000-a-day Minneapolis contractor named Westbrook and Seeley stood on the edge of a flooded soybean field in Pembina County, North Dakota, and counted, in plain English, the cost of one expensive mistake. 40 yards out, in the middle of that field, sat their machine. A brand-new Komatsu hydraulic excavator, 220 tons, $2 million off the lot. The pride of the contract. It had been there 6 days, sunk to the top of its tracks the morning after they unloaded it. 3 other machines had gone in to try to get it out, and 3 other machines had sunk in the same field, trying. A pair of D8 bulldozers were still bedded down 20 feet south of it. A second excavator, brought in on timber mats, had gone into its undercarriage on the 4th day. Westbrook and Seeley had now sunk, in that one flat field, a little over $3 million of heavy equipment and recovered none of it. The site superintendent, Carter Lindgren, finally lit a cigarette in the wet morning air and said the words his crew had been waiting 2 days to hear. Without the big Manitowoc dragline out of Minneapolis, he said, this field had beaten them. What he did not know, standing there in the cold drizzle, looking at $3 million of failure, was that the machine that could walk straight across that field had been parked in a Quonset hut, 4 miles east. Since 1953, the Red River Valley of the North runs flat as a tabletop along the border of Minnesota and North Dakota. And the dirt that lies under it for 40 miles in any direction is what the farmers there call gumbo. Black gumbo clay, the richest growing soil in the world when it is dry, and the wickedest piece of ground in the world when it is wet. Pembina County in the spring of 1991 was wet. The thaw had come late and come hard. The river had run over its banks in 3 places. A county drainage culvert was failing 15 miles south of Cavalier. And the only thing that stood between the bottomland farmers there and a lost planting season was a new drainage ditch that had to be cut, and a new culvert that had to be set, and it all had to happen before the corn went in. 4 miles east of the failing culvert lived a man named Walt Karlsen. To anyone in town, he was simply Walt. He was 79 years old that spring. He had been born on the farm. He still worked the same quarter section his Norwegian grandfather had broken with a walking plow in 1903, and he had farmed it now for more than 50 straight years. Walt was a tall, lean, dry-eyed man, white-haired and clean-shaven, who chewed on the wooden end of a kitchen matchstick in the corner of his mouth instead of talking when talking was not necessary, which to Walt's mind was most of the time. His wife of 56 years brought him his coffee at 4:30 every morning and his supper at 6. He had been the quiet, durable kind of man his whole life. Pembina County was full of them and did not, on the whole, take much notice. Behind Walt Karlsen's red farmhouse stood a Quonset hut of corrugated steel that he had put up himself the year after he came home from the war. And inside that Quonset hut, on a clean concrete floor that was swept once a week, sat a machine. It was a Caterpillar D7 crawler dozer, built in 1949. It was painted the yellow Caterpillar used in those days, only the yellow had faded, over 42 years, to the soft color of old butter. It had a long, straight angle blade on the front, and it had wide tracks, wider than what came on it from the factory, because Walt had welded extension grousers onto its track pads in 1962 to keep it from sinking in his own bottomland. It had a 6-cylinder Cat diesel under the hood that started cold on the 3rd turn of the starter at 20 below zero, and that ran all day at the same patient, deep, idling chug. What the young people in Pembina County did not know about that yellow tractor was what Walt Karlsen had done with it. In the spring of 1953, Walt and his older brother Lars had taken that D7 out into the bottomland of their own quarter section, 60 acres of standing water and black gumbo that no horse, no tractor, no man on foot had been able to cross in living memory. And over the course of one wet summer, with that one tractor, they had cut and graded the entire drainage system that turned that 60 acres of bog into the best soybean ground in the county. They had done what an engineering firm out of Fargo had said could not be done without the rental of a drag line. They had done it because Walt had figured out, by watching the way a duck stands on wet mud, the single rule that decides whether a heavy machine sinks in gumbo or doesn't. Walt had spent 40 years since then knowing that rule by heart. But that was old knowledge. And old knowledge does not announce itself. It waits to be asked. Walt heard about the trouble in the south end of the county the way he heard about everything that mattered at the Café and Cavalier, where the men sat with their coffee at 7 o'clock and laid the news of the county out on the Formica. "A contractor down from Minneapolis," the men said. 6 days now. 3 machines in the mud. The biggest excavator anyone in Pembina County had ever seen sunk to its cab. Walt did not say anything. He finished his coffee. He paid his 30 cents. And then he drove the 4 miles south, slow, in his old GMC pickup, and he stopped on the section road above the field, and he got out, and he stood at the wire fence, and he looked. He stood there nearly an hour. He looked at the field, and he looked at the way the modern komatsu sat in it, and he looked longest at the patches of standing water, and at the places where the grass had a faint green flush, and at the places where it didn't. He looked the way a man looks at his own field, after 50 years of knowing it. The duck knew. Walt knew. Then he got back in his pickup, and he drove home. And that evening, after supper, he walked out to the Quonset and laid his hand on the side of the D7. The crew at the field had done everything that money and modern engineering could think to do, and they were not fools. By the morning of the 4th day, they had tried 3 things, and 3 things had failed, and they were all sitting out there in plain view of the section road, like exhibits in a museum of expensive mistakes. The first thing they had tried was a pair of D8 dozers, one from each side with cable. The cable had come tight. The dozers had spun their tracks in the gumbo for 40 minutes, and then both of them had sunk, fast, into the same kind of mud the excavator was already in. The second thing they had tried was a smaller hydraulic excavator on a roadway of timber mats. The mats had floated, then tilted, then submerged, and the second excavator had gone down to its undercarriage in 3 hours. There was no third thing. The third thing was waiting 14 days out, in Minneapolis, on a rail car. By the morning of the 6th day, there were 2 men on the gravel road who were paid to make decisions, and there was a third man who liked to talk as though he were one of them. The site superintendent, Carter Lindgren, was a Westbrook and Seeley lifer in his late 50s, a man who had run drainage and pipeline jobs from the sand hills of Nebraska to the Saskatchewan border for the better part of 30 years, and who had never, in those 30 years, lost 3 machines on one field. He stood on that gravel road in his rain jacket and looked at his crew and his clipboard and his telephone and tried on every hour to make the arithmetic come out right. The arithmetic did not come out right. The Manitowoc drag line they wanted was booked solid through the end of the month on a Mississippi River levee job. The penalty clause in their county contract started to bite at $50,000 a day on the 8th of May, and it was the 22nd of April. 6 bottomland farmers in the south end of Pembina County were waiting to plant. Westbrook and Seeley's bond company was on the telephone twice a day now, asking questions in the voice that bond companies use just before they stop asking questions. The third man was Brad Sheridan, the equipment manager Westbrook and Seeley had sent up from Minneapolis. He was 34. He had an MBA. He had ideas, and he liked, on the whole, to share them. It was on the morning of the 6th day that Walt Karlsen drove down to the field for the second time, And this time he did not stand at the fence. He drove up the gravel road to where the crew was standing, and he got out of the GMC, and he waited politely until Carter Lindgren noticed him. And then he said, in the slow, mild way he said everything, he believed he could walk a tractor out to that excavator and bring it back. Carter Lindgren looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked Walt what he had in mind. He was a polite man, Carter Lindgren, and he had been raised by his mother. Walt told him. Wide feet, he said. Long steps. He said the gumbo would hold a heavy machine if the machine had enough track on the ground and if the machine never, for 1 second, sat still. He said his D7 had wide grousers that he had welded on himself 30 years ago. He said he would drive it across the same dirt those dozers, and that second excavator had sunk in and not stop, and the gumbo would not catch him. There was a small silence, and then Brad Sheridan, who had spent the last 6 days losing 6 days of his salary out there in the rain, and had heard about all he wanted to hear from old men in pickup trucks, laughed. He said, with the very slight edge of a man who has been to business school, "And what year, sir, was this tractor of yours built?" Walt took the matchstick out of his mouth, looked at it, put it back, and said, "It was built in 1949. Brad Sheridan said that was older than his mother. He said it like that was the end of the conversation, and the other contract men looked at the gravel and let it be the end of the conversation." Carter Lindgren, however, was a polite man, and what he did was, in its own quiet way, worse than the laughing. He thanked Walt. He said the company appreciated the offer. He said that this was a major insurance liability, that they had $2 million of equipment to recover, and that they could not, for reasons Walt would surely understand, allow a private citizen and an antique tractor to operate inside a Westbrook and Sealy job site. Walt heard him out. He did not change expression. He did not raise his voice. He nodded exactly once, and he said, "All right." That was all he said. He touched the brim of his cap. He got back in his pickup. He drove home because a man who knows a piece of dirt does not, in the end, need a Minneapolis contractor to believe him in order to keep on knowing it. He went out to the Quonset, and he ran the diesel block heater on the D7, just in case. 2 more days went by, and the year turned hard. The Red River fell 2 inches and then rose 4. A second cold rain came through. The field stayed black and wet and bottomless, and the komatsu sat in the middle of it now with brown water lapping at its tracks. The second excavator was lower than it had been. One of the D8 dozers had begun to lean to the south, the way a fence post leans in soft ground in the year before it falls over. The Manitowoc drag line did not come free. The bond company stopped asking polite questions. The county supervisor called Carter Lindgren from his kitchen twice in one evening and informed him that the 6 farmers in the south end of the county would not be planting on time, and that the failure of one Minneapolis contractor to install one county culvert was about to cost 6 families a soybean crop and a year of their lives. May the 8th was 11 days out. The penalty clause was real. Westbrook and Sealy was, that quietly, looking at a number on a piece of paper that ran into the millions, and at a company picture in the Cavalier Pioneer Press that no Minneapolis contractor was going to want hung on his wall. Carter Lindgren called every dragline operator from Minot to Duluth in those 2 days, and then he called the ones from Winnipeg, and there was nothing inside 2 weeks. On the evening of the 8th day, there was a meeting on the gravel road by the headlights of 3 pickup trucks. And out of that meeting came the kind of decision that men make when they have nothing left to lose. There would, Carter Lindgren said, be one more attempt. They would bring up the largest crawler dozer Westbrook and Sealy had in its yard down in Minneapolis, a 1986 D9, 90,000 pounds on a lowboy, by morning. They would cut it loose at the edge of the field, and they would run it straight in, and they would not stop, and they would chain it to the komatsu, and they would either pull the komatsu out or sink the D9 alongside it. Either way, Carter Lindgren said, they would have a number, and they would call the bond company, and they would tell them the truth. The D9 came up on the lowboy at 5 in the morning. By 6 it was in the field. By 6:25 it had stopped moving. By 7 it was sunk to its undercarriage exactly the way the others had sunk, and its engine, which they had not shut off, was screaming itself dead trying to get free. Carter Lindgren walked out into the road, took off his hard hat, and put it on the hood of his truck. And he said nothing at all. And then an old man spoke up. His name was Olaf Hansen, and he was 76 years old, and he had retired 4 years before from a small drainage contracting outfit out of Grafton that he had run for nearly 40 years. He had driven down that morning to see, in his own words, what a $2 million machine looked like when it was sitting where $1.50's worth of duck would have known not to sit. Olaf Hansen stood at the fence beside Carter Lindgren and looked at the 4 sunk machines, and at the gumbo, and at the gray sky. And then he said, "Before you call the bond company, before you put it in writing, somebody go and get Walt Karlsen." Carter Lindgren turned to him and started to say something about insurance and liability and the limits of antique equipment on a modern job site. And Olaf Hansen, who had known Walt Karlsen for 58 years, and who had been there in 1953 when Walt and his brother had drained 60 acres of bog with that yellow cat, looked at him sideways and said mildly, "Son, you have already spent $3 million of liability on this field. I am telling you to drive 4 miles east and find a man." They heard him before they saw him. It was a sound the older men in the crowd knew well, though most of them had not heard it in 25 years. It was not the high-pitched bark of a new diesel. It was lower and slower and rougher, a deep, 6-cylinder, idling chug-chug-chug-chug, the kind of unhurried iron heartbeat that the old cat diesels used to make, the kind of engine sound that belonged to fields and to barns, and to a generation of men who had broken the prairie a second time after the Dust Bowl was done with it. And then they saw it. It came down the gravel section road at a fast walking pace, because that is the pace a D7 goes, and the yellow paint had faded over 42 years to the color of old butter, and the tracks were wider than any factory ever sent it out with, and Walt Karlsen sat up high on the operator's seat in a faded canvas barn jacket, one hand on the steering clutch lever, the other on the throttle, the wooden matchstick still in the corner of his mouth. He had been ready, the men in the crowd would say later. He had warmed the diesel block. He had topped off the tank. He had been ready since the morning of the second day. He had simply been waiting to be asked. Walt did not get off the tractor when he reached the field. He drove the D7 to the fence at the edge of the gravel road and stopped it there with the diesel still chugging, and he sat on the seat for a quarter of an hour, and he looked. He looked the way he had looked at the field a week before from the wire. He looked at where the standing water lay, and at where the grass had its faint green flush, and at where it didn't. He looked at the 4 sunk machines, and he looked, longest, at the long low rise of harder ground that ran like a buried causeway across the southwest corner of the field, a rise that the modern survey had never noticed, and that the modern excavator had crossed without thinking, the way a man wades a stream he does not know. Then he climbed down, and he walked to the back of the dozer, and he uncoiled a length of heavy cable that he had brought from his own tool shed, and he laid it on the floor of the cab, and he climbed back up. He turned to the crowd at the fence, and he spoke for the second time that morning. He said 2 things only. The first thing was this. He said, "The duck knows. The duck knows that on saturated gumbo You stand on as much of your foot as you can stand on, and you do not stand still. Because gumbo, when you stand still, becomes the thing that eats you. The second thing he said was, I am not stopping until I come back. Nobody, and he looked at Carter Lindgren when he said this, and at Brad Sheridan, nobody flags me down out there. Nobody waves at me. If I stop on that ground, I will not start again. And you will lose a fifth machine. Is that understood? And Carter Lindgren, who had spent 30 years in heavy construction and had thought, until that morning, that he had heard everything a man could say about working in mud, nodded once and said yes. It was understood. Walt Karlsen put the matchstick back in his mouth. He put the D7 into low gear, and he opened the throttle. And then the old yellow cat did the thing that no machine on that field for 6 days had done. It walked. The diesel ran up to a steady working roar. The wide grousers bit, and the D7 moved off the gravel and onto the gumbo. The crowd at the fence held its breath. The tracks made a long, even sucking sound as they pressed the wet clay flat, and then they came up clean, and the next yard of ground was already under them. The D7 did not slow. It did not hesitate. It did not, for 1 second, sit still. Walt held a line that nobody else on that field had seen. He took the D7 along the buried causeway he had read out of the grass, swung wide around the sunk D8 dozers, came in on the Komatsu from the east where the gumbo was, by inches, a hair firmer. The water lifted off the tracks in low fans on either side. The yellow paint, in the gray light, looked older than the field. He reached the Komatsu at 12 minutes after 11 o'clock in the morning. He did not get down. He swung the D7 around so its drawbar faced the great sunken excavator, and from the operator's seat, never stopping the throttle, his tracks still working a slow in-place crawl that kept the gumbo from closing under him. He hand-signaled to a young rigger from Westbrook and Sealy, who ran out across the dry gravel and into the field in hip boots, with the chain that the old man had asked for. The chain went on. Walt nodded once, and then the yellow cat began, foot by foot, to walk back the way it had come. The chain came tight. The D7 chugged. The Komatsu, $2 million of modern hydraulic engineering, sunk to its cab in black gumbo, for 6½ days moved. It moved an inch. It moved a foot. The mud let go of it in the long, low, squeaking groan that gumbo makes when it has been overruled. And the great machine slid, slowly and unwillingly, back along the dent it had made in the field. The D7 never strained, and it never spun, and it never, for 1 second, stopped walking. 40 minutes after Walt Karlsen had taken his tractor onto the field, the Komatsu hydraulic excavator was sitting on the gravel road, whole, undamaged, $50,000 in the wash, perhaps, in cleaning out the gumbo from its undercarriage, but alive, recoverable, back inside the world of running machines. 40 minutes, 6 days, the field had held it. 40 minutes Walt Karlsen had taken to bring it home. Walt Karlsen, having brought the Komatsu out, did not drive his tractor off the field. He drove it back on. He turned the D7 90 degrees, dropped the long angle blade, and without speaking another word to Carter Lindgren or Brad Sheridan or anyone else standing on that gravel road, he began. In the long, unhurried passes of a man who had cut more drainage in his life than the United States Army Corps of Engineers had cut in that county since the Second World War, to dig the ditch that the modern excavator had been hired to dig. He worked through the afternoon, and he worked into the evening with his headlights on. And by 10 o'clock that night, the new drainage ditch was cut from the failing culvert to the river slough straight, true, and graded right. By morning, he was back on it, with the blade set finer, and by sundown the next day, the cut was done. The new culvert went in 2 days after that. The water dropped. The gumbo dried. And on the 2nd of May, 6 days before the penalty clause was due, to bite, the 6 bottomland farmers in the south end of Pembina County started their planters. On the evening Walt Karlsen finished the cut, Carter Lindgren walked out across the gravel road to where the yellow cat sat idling, and he stood at the side of it until Walt cut the throttle, and he took off his hard hat, and he held it in both hands. He said, "Mr. Karlsen, on behalf of Westbrook and Seeley, I owe you an apology." He said it loud enough that every man on the crew heard it. Walt looked down at him from the operator's seat. He took the matchstick out of his mouth, and he said, mildly the way he said everything, "No, you don't. You only owe yourself one. You should have asked a neighbor." Brad Sheridan, the equipment manager from Minneapolis, was not on the gravel road that evening, and he was not there the next morning. The Westbrook and Seeley Company truck he had been driving was gone by Tuesday. He had been, the men on the crew said quietly to each other, reassigned. Some weeks later, in the cafe in Cavalier, a young man at the next booth, a county extension agent, recently hired, recently arrived, asked Walt Karlsen straight out. He asked him how he had been so sure, that morning in April, that an old crawler dozer could walk where a $2 million excavator could not. Walt thought about it for a while. He stirred his coffee. He looked out the window at the sky. And then he said this. He said the modern machines fought the ground. They sat down on the gumbo like a man sitting in a chair, and they thought their weight and their horsepower would settle the question. The gumbo, he said, settled the question instead, every single time. The old machines, he said, had been built before any of that horsepower was for sale. The men who built them knew gumbo. They put wide feet under them, and they gave them slow gears, and they taught the men who ran them never to sit down on wet ground. He said, a duck knows where to put its foot, and a duck knows never to keep it down when the ground says don't. He said, the old machines learned to walk on the ground. The new ones tried to stand on it. There is the difference. He said no more than that. The 1949 Caterpillar D7 sits, polished and idle, in the same Quonset hut in Pembina County, North Dakota. The yellow has faded one more shade since 1991. The wide grousers Walt welded on in 1962 are still on it. The Quonset still has its swept concrete floor. Walt Karlsen has been gone these several years. His wife, too. The farm is run now by a grandson, who keeps the tractor the way the old man kept it, and who fires it once a year at the threshing reunion at Walhalla, where children climb on it the way children climb on old machines anywhere, in places where the old machines have not yet been forgotten. The drainage ditch Walt cut in April of 1991 still carries the runoff of 6 soybean fields to the Red River. The county put up no plaque. The Pioneer Press wrote no story. Most of the men who watched him that morning have grown old themselves, but the duck still knows, and perhaps the men who build the newest machines and the men who run them, and the men who write the checks for them might do well to remember the lesson of that wet April morning in 1991. That the heaviest machine on the field is not always the one that knows the ground, and that an old tractor, set on wide feet by a quiet man who knew where to put them, can still walk where modern money could not even stand. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on this channel. Forgotten Machines, Quiet Men, and the Work They Did. Subscribe, and we'll tell you the next one.